Shadow Hack. Chapter 551, Admiralty cover reaches Great Circle. 1.78 million. Li Yunmu narrowed his eyes and looked at the number of comprehension points obtained in return for forgetting several hundred low-level foundational skills. Yet although this number appeared to be huge, it was only enough to upgrade 3A grade foundational skills to Great Circle and nothing more. Li Yunmu thought for a while and finally decided on Insect's Step, Great Heights, Absolute Defense Tyrant Boxing, Perfection, and Violent Blade Tyrannical Heavenly Chop. Experience makes progress easy. He raised these three skills to the 9th level, Extraordinary Sage, in proficiency by throwing all his comprehension points on them. After this, only 480,000 remained of the original 1.78 million points. But Li Yunmu wasn't finished yet. Right after, he chose to use the breakthrough function on 3A grade skills. System, have Insect's Step, Absolute Defense Tyrant Boxing, and Violent Blade Tyrannical Heavenly Chop breakthrough. The reason why Li Yunmu hadn't chosen the suddenly appeared Violent Blade Critical Leap Strike, but one footwork method and two burst fatal moves had to do with the enemies he was facing at the moment. Although each strike of Violent Blade Critical Leap Strike was more ferocious than the last one, it couldn't inflict heavy injuries onto enemies of the same level or someone more formidable in one strike, but the other two skill could do that. Ding! Each breakthrough for an A-grade skill requires 100,000 comprehension points. So the system will deduct 300,000 comprehension points. Do you confirm the breakthrough? Yes. Once he said those words, a shadow appeared in Li Yunmu's mind. Using some fantastic movements which were hard to anticipate, it moved using high-speed frequency conversion, leaving a false image with every step it took. When all 9 moves had been unleashed, 9 identical shadows dashed forward. For a moment, even Li Yunmu felt a great headache while trying to distinguish between the false and true among the 9 shadows. The people who could see through the essence of this technique were definitely terrifying existences. What formidable mirage footwork! This is the result produced after a Great Circle Insect Step broke through. Li Yunmu was stunned. This was the most formidable footwork method he had seen in recent times. Not only did it allow the user to burst forth with extremely high movement speed, it also possessed properties like producing mirages. Once one divided into 9, it was basically impossible to anticipate which one was real. The technique had multitudes of changes, made it difficult to know what was false and what was real, and gave him a formidable boost in speed. This was the final form of Insect Step once it had broken through. After a series of repetitions, Li Yunmu finally became clear-headed and received system's notification in his brain. Congratulations! Once your Insect Step reached Extraordinary Sage level, it smoothly broke through to S-grade high-speed frequency conversion method 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step. Starting from now, your cultivation of 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step is at the first layer, initial stage. 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step? Good, good, good. Li Yunmu couldn't help but continue praising it. The breakthrough of his Insect Step would increase his combat strength tremendously. A formidable flux expert could do without a powerful cultivation method, but he absolutely needed a body tempering and movement technique. After all, the existence of a formidable footwork technique would definitely influence their speed in a combat, whether it was dodging, fleeing for their life, or perhaps rushing to hunt down the enemy. A formidable footwork technique was necessary for all of those events. The transformation of 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step instantly filled Li Yunmu with expectations for the breakthrough of Absolute Defense Tyrant Boxing and Violent Blade Tyrannical Heavenly Chop. After the shadow in his consciousness finished demonstrating the 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step, its imposing manner changed. Power erupted from its body, and the shadow began to emit a powerful blade intent. Pang! The shadow suddenly chopped down, and the blade intent of this strike seemed to pass through space and time, breaking out of Li Yunmu's consciousness. Instantly, his entire consciousness filled with the tyrannical blade intent of the chop. Congratulations, host, your Violent Blade Tyrannical Heavenly Chop, the proficiency of which had reached extraordinary sage level, has broken through to S-grade extremely fatal blade skill Heavenly Blade. At this point, your Heavenly Blade is at the first step. After that, absolute defense tyrant boxing also didn't disappoint him. The shadow in his brain collected the blade and dispersed the blade intent before launching an explosive punch. Once it was released, Li Yunmu felt like only this attack existed in the entire universe. One punch to break the mountains, and one punch to blow away the heavens. There was no aggressiveness, only disaster and calamity. Congratulations, your absolute defense tyrant boxing, which had attained extraordinary sage level, broke through to S-grade fatal boxing disaster punch. Right now, it is at the first layer, initial access. It was a great increase in strength. Li Yunmu hadn't expected that in a short time, he would surprisingly grasp 2 S-grade fatal moves. Although the second technique, unique shadow heavenly blade chop, comprehended by the shadows was also S-grade, it was too wasteful. If he used this lethal skill, it would mean that all his shadows would be exterminated. This had been his only S-grade lethal skill unique shadow heavenly blade chop. Once he used it, all shadows would combine with him to launch a final strike. After it, regardless of whether the enemy was heavily wounded or not, his shadows would be permanently exterminated and wouldn't recover again. Thus, after comprehending this extremely lethal skill, Li Yunmu had never dared to use. If he used it, that would mean that he had already stepped onto the road to disaster. But his situation had changed. Hu is now in possession of Heavenly Blade and Disaster Punch as well as 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step. Although they didn't increase his strength, and his innate expert armor didn't reach the divine grade, he had become much more dangerous compared to before. Before his foundational skills had broken through to S grade, his combat strength would have allowed him to fight against mid-stage Sage Flux expert on equal terms at best. Yet right now, he had confidence in being able to kill a mid-stage Sage Flux expert. In fact, he could even cut a path of blood under the eyes of a late-stage Sage Flux expert by relying on 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step. The difference between his situation before and now was extremely large. Earlier, he could only battle on even terms, while now he could kill. After Li Yunmu finished sorting out the foundational skills, he continued with his unrelenting determination to grow stronger. His gaze thus fell upon the cultivation methods. This time, he didn't need to upgrade any cultivation methods other than body tempering ones. He wanted to increase the defense of his body to the pinnacle. He didn't hesitate to use the large amount of ability points he had saved up. He had cultivated Admiralty cover to 60th layer, but because the amount of ability points required to upgrade further was astronomical, he had stopped his cultivation of this method. But now? System, increase the cultivation of Admiralty cover to 99th level and don't hesitate to pay any price. As for Devil Dragon Bone Refining Armor? Previously, he had only cultivated this cultivation method to the 30th level and congealed a bone armor. After that, he hadn't continued to upgrade the skill. Right now though, he used the ability points to upgrade it to Great Circle. As for the cross-cover armor? This was a cultivation method for physical flux experts of the origin world. His cultivation of this method had reached 99th level long ago, which meant that his flesh had formed infinitesimally small square blocks. Unfortunately though, his Great Sun Thunder Tyrant Body Muscle Marrow Secrets, which was his most powerful body refining cultivation method, couldn't be upgraded by using ability points. This cultivation method needed an even higher quality energy unit to rise. Anyway, Li Yunmu had used up his cherished ability points to increase the cultivation of Admiralty cover and Devil Dragon Bone Refining Armor. Both of these tyrannical body refining cultivation methods had reached Great Circle. And the amount of ability points which had reached above 270 million had dropped to 30 million. However, this price was completely worth it. Admiralty cover at 99th level didn't reduce 99% of the incoming damage as Li Yunmu had imagined, since it apparently had a maximum limit of 70%. However, after it had reached the Great Circle, Li Yunmu obtained a new formidable ability which was called Admiralty War. Chapter 552, Great Increase in Physical Strength and Coming Out of Seclusion. Naturally, since Li Yunmu had chosen Admiralty War at the Great Circle, Safeguard, which he had gained previously, was removed. But even so, Li Yunmu thought it was worth it. This was because with this ability, he felt that the only weakness in his defense had been complemented. As expected, Admiralty War wasn't an offensive ability, but rather focused on defense. Li Yunmu closed his eyes and sensed the small golden dragon wandering through his meridians and flux points. The golden energy had greatly increased the security and immunity of his internal organs. Strictly speaking, Admiralty War only existed inside his body. Only if the enemy possessed tremendous strength and Li Yunmu was unable to resist them, allowing destructive power to permeate into his body, that Admiralty cover would be unleashed. It would transform into a ferocious dragon and would devour all of the destructive energy. Furthermore, if Li Yunmu consumed a highly lethal poison by accident, the golden dragon would turn his body into a battlefield and defeat the energy which had permeated his body. It would swallow it whole, allowing Li Yunmu to live unharmed. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that with the appearance of Admiralty War, Li Yunmu's defense had become akin to an iron bucket. Whether it was the outside or the inside, there were no holes through which something could leak. It has to be said that this ultimate ability which appeared when Admiralty cover reached the 99th layer excited Li Yunmu from the bottom of his heart. Compared to that, the final ability produced by Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets upon reaching Great Circle was a little weaker. But even so, he was quite satisfied with it as well. Only one ability was produced when Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets reached Great Circle, and it increased his physical power. The bones in Li Yunmu's body acted like they were made of metal and possessed astonishing density. Each of his kicks and punches surged with brute force and were unusually strong. Based on the system's calculations, Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets had increased the strength of Li Yunmu's bones to a level where even if a battleship weighing more than 100,000 tons knocked into him at a high speed, he would still be able to resist the impact with the strength of his bones. That was right, the cultivation method was this abnormal and formidable. Furthermore, Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets had increased Li Yunmu's physical strength by another 1,000 tons. After his strength had increased by 1,500 tons after absorbing the Red God Fruit, then without counting his flux energy strength, his pure physical strength was now 2,500 tons. Even if Azure Dragon Expert Armor didn't amplify his flux energy strength, he could battle with a mid-stage Sage Flux Expert based solely on his physical strength, which was 2,500 oxen. The scariness of Li Yunmu's physical strength could be clearly seen from this. He was almost certain that in this world, he was the only person who had reached such a terrifying height. Even the countless talents of the origin world wouldn't be able to reach such physical strength. After all, he was only able to do so because of the combined efforts of Admiralty cover, Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets, Cross Cover Armor, and Great Sun Thunder Tyrant Body Muscle Marrow Secrets. These were 4 body tempering cultivation methods, with the lowest of them being A grade. Once done with that, around 300,000 ability points remained. Li Yunmu didn't keep them in reserve and decided to exchange them all to increase his strength. He followed the principle of doing it to the end or not doing it at all. He threw all of the remaining 300,000 something ability points on Ghostly Image Substitution and Ghostly Evasion. The two were his main escaping and life-saving techniques. From the cultivation methods he'd acquired from the ghosts, he had focused on these 2 skills, and now quickly raised them to the Great Circle. This increased his survivability. As for 300-something million experience points, he used them all straight away. He was the type of person who would finish a task once he started it. He used all the experience points on congealing more shadows. When he had congealed the 12th shadow, he had used up 20 million experience points. When he congealed the 13th shadow, he spent 30 million experience points, 40 million for 14th shadow, 50 million for 15th shadow, 60 million for 16th shadow, 70 million for 17th shadow, 80 million for 18th shadow. The 390 million experience points allowed him to congeal 6 more shadows. In the end, only 60 million points were left. Once all the foundational skills and cultivation methods had been sorted out and the number of shadows was raised to 18, the end result stunned Li Yunmu. He didn't care one bit that he had used up all the points he had accumulated. It was definitely worth it, despite losing the long-term benefits. Sometimes, experts had to strive for their present. If they couldn't even preserve their life, they would lose everything. Although the original plan couldn't keep up with the changes and requires decisive adjustments, Li Yunmu's strength had swelled greatly even if his cultivation hadn't increased in the slightest. In the depths of a gloomy snow-filled mountain, a silhouette was sitting motionlessly in the cave. It suddenly opened its eyes, and the entire mountainside began to dry up and melt as if it had encountered a volcanic eruption. A formidable bloodline energy soared like a rocket. The snow which had been accumulating for a long time was like butter which had met a burning hot knife in front of the astonishing energy soaring into the heavens. Flying Snow Mountain, which had seen no changes for many millenniums, gradually began to melt at that moment. The attack of this extremely formidable energy instantly caused the expressions of all the people of S.H.A.D.W to change. They swiftly looked at the mountain peak where Li Yunmu was located. What formidable power and terrifying might! Given the surging energy, this person is at least at Great Circle. Flying Snow Mountain? When has such a terrifying character appeared at Flying Snow Mountain? That's not right. The women of Flying Snow Mountain could never cultivate this formidable power with a masculine presence. Li Yunmu's exit from seclusion caused some extremely terrifying movement which instantly attracted the attention of more than 10 second-tier sects in the surroundings. The blood energy soaring into the heavens was like a crimson blood dragon. It flew into the sky while enveloping the entire Flying Snow Mountain range without dispersing. Not good, some formidable enemy has invaded this land. Our Flying Snow Mountain is in danger. Immediately unleash the mountain guarding formation. Quickly gather the elders to welcome the enemy. At this instant, a middle-aged woman who still looked attractive suddenly came out of seclusion on the main peak of Flying Snow Mountain and looked at the enormous dragon formed of blood and chi. She couldn't help but tremble slightly. Boom! At this instant, the soaring energy suddenly caused an enormous explosion. Li Yunmu used the mountain peak as a springboard to jump into the sky with a loud yell. With Azure Dragon Expert Armor, which released cyan flames, as well as the tremendous blood and chi attacking the night, Li Yunmu was like a war god. He couldn't control himself and suppress the intense battle intent rushing out from his body. Admiralty War's dragon coursing through his body filled him with battle intent which he had been enduring for a long time. After his strength had greatly increased, he wanted to battle and kept howling for a long time. Chapter 553, Return to the Earth. Rumble. A sound echoed, and like a meteor shooting down from the horizon, Li Yunmu landed heavily on the ground in front of Demon. He was covered in cyan flames from head to toe while clad in Azure Dragon Expert Armor. Earlier, he had battled with a few elders of Flying Snow Mountain. After this exercise, he finally realized the extent of his present strength. It has to be said that although Flying Snow Mountain was only an upper middle grade sect among the second-tier powers, all of the defenses were completely activated the moment Li Yunmu appeared without concealing his battle intent in their territory. 4 initial stage Sage Elders in addition to 2 mid-stage Sage Elders as well as the sect leader had all shown up. Altogether, 7 Sage Flux experts had surrounded and jointly attacked Li Yunmu. During the heaven-shaking and earth-shattering battle, Li Yunmu discovered that his combat strength had reached an unfathomable level. Once his physical strength reached the peak when his tyrannical body refining methods achieved Great Circle, his power had become majestic and boundless. Each punch and kick was filled with enormous explosive power. The absolute defense provided by Azure Dragon expert armor and his tyrannical physical body ensured that he would be able to easily escape unscathed from the joint attack of 7 Sage-level powerhouses. During the battle, Li Yunmu had become clear in his heart that even a true mid-stage Sage Flux expert of the Origin world would most likely be unable to injure him. The most attention-worthy technique in the battle was his Admiralty War, which made sure that the ice-cold flux energy, which was the pride of Flying Snow Mountain, couldn't invade his body and wreak havoc inside. It wouldn't be the slightest exaggeration to say that compared to 2 months ago before he entered Seclusion, his defense no longer had any flaws or fatal gaps. With his innate expert armor and monstrous physical strength, it was difficult for a mid-stage Sage Flux expert to injure him. As long as the enemy wasn't a late-stage Sage Flux expert, Li Yunmu wouldn't put them in his eyes. Thus, the battle had bolstered his confidence. So what's the matter? Where are Li Qinghong, Hai Yu, and the other women? By then, Li Yunmu had already escaped the siege of the several Sage Flux experts of Flying Snow Mountain. He had then relied on the vague connection between master and follower to find Demon, who was hiding in the woods in a sorry shape. Just a single glance at him caused Li Yunmu's complexion to change. Demon was in a quite bad shape, but the important thing was that Li Qinghong, Hai Yu, Xiu, and Ruin Lanzi were nowhere to be seen. An accident has happened, Master. The descenders from all regions had been hurried over, according to their original plan. But yesterday, they were attacked by a formidable old man. All of them, including Sister Qinghong and Hai Yu, were abducted by him. If I hadn't concealed myself here because of your order, I probably would have also been exposed. Without caring for his sorry state, Demon narrated everything that had happened in the last couple days. When he finished the story, he solemnly took out a jade stone and gave it to Li Yunmu. The old man had left this jade stone behind after capturing everyone. I think that he deliberately left it for you. Underworld Serpent's sound recording stone. Once Li Yunmu took a glance at the jade stone, his complexion changed. A background image of the underworld's abyss was carved on top of the jade stone. It portrayed a serpent struggling to crawl out of the abyss. If this wasn't the mark of the underworld serpent, then what was? He truly hadn't expected that they would manage to trace his location. Only after joining the organization had Li Yunmu realized that underworld serpent's genuine strength was close to that of a first-tier power. After he took the sound recording jade stone, he lightly inputted some energy. As time passed, his complexion turned increasingly more gloomy. He faintly spit out, "Great Circle Sage Flux Expert Good One, Underworld Serpent. I have greatly underestimated you." What? That old man was actually a Great Circle Sage powerhouse. Demon shivered slightly. Until that moment, he had thought that he had escaped detection. Yet it was more than likely that he had been discovered in the so-called depths of the woods, but the old man had deliberately let him go to bring all the information to his master. So what should we do now? All of our Earth's descenders, including Sister Qinghong, are in his hands. When confronted with a legendary character standing at the peak of the world, even Demon, who had witnessed miracles created by Li Yunmu, began to lose confidence. After staying silent for a long while, Li Yunmu clenched his teeth and replied with a cold sneer. What to do now? We can only do as they ask. We can only do as they ask. That's right. You return to Green Goblin Mountain and hide yourself there. Take some flux binding pills and cultivation methods, and until I show up again, don't leave that region for any reason. Li Yunmu took out various items for cultivation and gave them to Demon as if this was his last gift to him. Master. Demon trembled from head to toe, and he fiercely shook his head. I won't leave. Even if we die, we should die together. I, Demon, am not someone who fears for his life. Moreover, since my soul imprint is bound to Master's heavenly world, my fate is bound to you. So if you are doomed, then so am I. Listen to me. I am not going to throw away my life. Even if I was to encounter a Great Circle Sage Flux expert, I might not be trampled upon. Not to mention that I don't plan on confronting the other party right now. Go now, return to Green Goblin Mountain. As long as you return to the mountain sect, Underworld Serpent won't create much trouble for you. Li Yunmu didn't allow Demon to continue speaking. After his strength had reached the present stage, a single demon wouldn't be able to provide any assistance to him. Instead, his follower would only get in the way. Even Li Qinghong, who possessed great potential, would be the same. Only if any of them could congeal innate expert armor could they help him, otherwise, they would find it hard to follow him in the future. Take care of yourself. After being ruthlessly cast away, Demon gave a profound glance to Li Yunmu and departed, since he had no other choice. Right then, he couldn't clearly make out the exact strength of his master. It's time to return to Earth. Since the opponent has taken hostages to threaten me to appear before them, I will fulfill their wishes. Let's see who is more patient of the two of us. No one, even Demon, couldn't anticipate Li Yunmu's thoughts. Underworld Serpent's abduction of all the Descenders had actually relieved him and settled a major headache for him. He would definitely rescue them, but not now. Underworld Serpent, since you want to force my hand, don't blame me for falling out with you. Once Li Yunmu saw Demon's departing figure, he took in a deep breath. The next instant, he returned to his heavenly world. With a single thought, he attracted a heavenly path passing through space. It extended to the heavenly world, and he went up it without any hesitation. Chapter 554, Descent to Lucky Wind City. The Earth had long ago sunk into chaos. Regardless of whichever continent it was, as long as people accidentally raised their heads, they would not be able to see the blue sky. Instead, there were phantoms from other worlds. They were similar to mirages, which were extremely staged and false, yet inadvertently emitting genuinely intimidating presence. At this time, even ordinary people had become agitated, let alone Fluxers. They felt that Earth's heavenly transformation was about to descend. Under such circumstances, it didn't matter if it was the central continent or the desolate continent, nor if it was the higher dimensional continent, northern continent, or Holy Spirit continent. The lives of humans in each and every continent were filled with chaos. This was especially so because the phantoms in the sky were transforming quickly, coming increasingly closer and becoming increasingly more genuine. With such a sight every day, the humans on Earth had gone crazy. None of the rulers could control the situation, regardless of whether they were ordinary sages or even half-deity battle sages. After all, facing the frightening future of the heavenly transformation, the life form which possessed great intelligence had begun to lose all reason. My God, this world is going to collapse. When people got out of bed every day, the first thing they did was to look at the sky. After gazing for a long time, they would find the phantom images which filled the sky having become more real. 3 months ago, when this phenomenon had begun, they were only blurry images in the distant background. But by then, the phantom images had become clear enough for their faces to be seen. Even the details like fingers and bestial claws could be identified. Ordinary people didn't know the significance of it, but the people at the peak of the Earth's strength pyramid were well aware that it implied that the 66 different planes were getting increasingly closer to combining. Our descenders, is there still no news of their return? In my opinion, we no longer have time to wait for them. Your Grace Pope, has your faction figured out how much time we have till the heavenly transformation? If nothing unexpected happens, it could be as soon as 6 months, but the longest wouldn't surpass a year. The current situation cannot continue. At least as we wait for our descenders to return with good news, we must settle the question of Shadow Sacred Female. Otherwise, we won't have the strength to vie for survival with the powers of other planes. Your Majesty, Vega's words are correct. It is time that we let go of our grudges. We must combine our forces and invade 7th dimension to purify sacred shadow female Ling Shuang. Declare your position, Battle God. If all of you view our Earth's benefits as a priority, then war god temple and divine religion should wait until our Earth's position has stabilized after merging with other planes to settle their grudges. The rude and headstrong barbarian kings who couldn't talk reason displayed an unusual position. In front of formidable power, even people as domineering as the barbarian kings had no option but to lower their heads. All right. Under the watchful gazes of half-step deity characters, Battle God who had remained silent for a long time nodded his head. This person was considered as the most powerful person on the earth besides the Flux ancestor. Even if he had lost the 4 pieces of Battle Barbarian Supreme Suit, his strength was still sufficient to make every peak powerhouse to feel endless apprehensions. When he finally agreed to put aside their grudges, the other powerhouses breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't that they wanted armistice, but that they had no other option but to stop fighting. In front of them was the heavenly transformation which was getting closer with each passing day, while behind them was the sacred shadow female Ling Shuang who now lead the entire 7th dimension to threaten them. Under the pressure of these 2 factors, the people standing at the peak were finally forced to reach an agreement. It's good that this has been settled. There's not much time, so we have to join our forces and attack the 7th dimension in 10 days without leaving anyone behind. This negotiations were done in the royal court of the central continent. The news from it spread to every nook and cranny of the world in a flash. At the same time as these changes happened, all the sage-level powerhouses leading their sects full strength, including all the transcending and nirvana flux masters, entered the legendary 7th dimension in succession. Originally, it was difficult for those under Sage realm to enter the 7th dimension, but all the battle sages were cooperating at that moment. Because of that, they could use an unprecedented amount of power to forcefully open a passage. Everyone was clear in their hearts that there would be many casualties in this battle, and even sages wouldn't be able to escape. The many flux masters in the large force battle would mainly act as cannon fodder and nothing else. Even those who had recently entered Sage realm wouldn't be considered anything more than ordinary fighters. The genuine core of this army was actually the domain sages and the most powerful experts under the sky, the battle sages. 10 days passed by, and the half-deity battle sages of the whole earth gathered together. They led a force of tens of thousands of fluxers to storm the 7th dimension. Only the transcending flux masters or lower cultivation fluxers remained on earth, which clearly displayed the resolve of the most powerful people in the world. The absolute majority of Earth's strength was involved in this time's all-out attack. However, the people standing at the peak of Earth were still late in hardening their resolve. Who could have expected that within the brief period of 1 year, the sacred shadow female could have surprisingly united the forces of the majority of the 7th dimension? A large decisive battle erupted between the 2 sides. High-level human fluxers began to perish in large numbers in the first wave of the decisive battle. But an arrow which had been shot could not be called back. The human powerhouses had already made up their minds that unless they killed the shadow sacred female, they would not retreat. The 55th Earth gradually sunk into endless bloodshed, which continued without an end in sight. 3 months passed in this manner. On that day, the heavens suddenly changed, and a large hole appeared in the skies. A heavenly bridge that seemed to come from heaven itself was established without any base. Surprisingly, the other endpoint of the heavenly bridge was the trifling Lucky Wind city located at the coast of the central continent. The sudden appearance of this extraordinary phenomenon stunned the humans of the 6 continents. And like that, the obscure little town of the central continent instantly became the center of attention. Lucky Wind City. Could it be possible that he has returned? Have you returned? Mumbled a mature woman sitting on the supreme seat of Heavenly Cloud City's Lord. It was likely that most people in the world would not associate the descent of the heavenly bridge in Lucky Wind City with the descent of that person. After all, although he was outstanding once upon a time, he a trifling flux disciple, a chess piece and nothing more. But at that moment, Lin Yuero had a feeling which instantly shattered her patience, which had lasted for 5 years. Chapter 555, Becoming a Player from a Chess Piece. Lucky Wind City was suddenly illuminated by an enormous dragon that descended from the heavens in front of an outdated residential unit and carefully observed it. In reality, it wasn't a dragon, but the halo of a heavenly bridge. If the half-step battle sages were there, they would have definitely cried out in surprise. Guided heavenly bridge. However, the small coastal town located in the territory of the central continent's heavenly cloud city didn't have many experienced people. Thus, admiration filled the hearts of everyone who looked at this extraordinary phenomenon. Their gazes were filled with worship, fear. Some held hope toward it while others were afraid that this extraordinary phenomenon would disturb the peaceful life of their small town. Suddenly, one person's mouth went wide open from shock. The little girl had noticed a human silhouette walking down the heavenly bridge. "There's someone up there. My God, what am I seeing? Why is someone walking down from the sky?" The girl's voice alarmed more and more people. But no one dared to get too close. They watched from the distance as a slender and tall figure which seemed to belong to a man gradually walked down and disappeared from everyone's gaze. Instantly, the news of the extraordinary phenomenon of heavens descending in Lucky Wind City and a person walking down from the sky instantly began to spread from this coastal town. It was like a Category 12 typhoon. But all of this didn't concern the main culprit of this incident. Paying respects to Master. The instant Li Yunmu descended on the outdated residential unit, his followers welcomed him. The moment Li Yunmu's presence returned to Earth, his followers immediately became aware that their master had come back because of the special connection which existed between them. Blade Overlord and Flowing Cloud left the building and welcomed Li Yunmu excitedly. "Master, you have finally returned." Blade Overlord felt familiar yet unfamiliar energy emitted by Li Yunmu, and his expression betrayed his excitement. At his side was Li Yunmu's former maid, Flowing Cloud. She was standing at attention with a complex expression. After the years in which they hadn't seen him, she had become unable to sense his limits. Although he had retracted his aura inside his body, he was still unable to conceal the enormous energy soaring into the heavens. It made both of his followers feel like they would get burned by the scorching sun. They were unable to even imagine the extent of his physical strength. "Good work, you both look good." Li Yunmu first sized up the two followers who had remained on Earth and then praised them without holding back. Right after though, his gaze locked onto the residential unit from which three people slowly walked out. "Dad, Mom, Sis Ru and I have returned." After the separation of several years, their family had finally united. "As long as you come back safe," his elderly mother mumbled with teary eyes as she came to embrace him in a tight hug, not letting go. His dad, in the meantime, forcefully held back his emotions and kept looking at the mother and son hugging each other from side. Lu Ruyan quietly brushed her eyes. Just a while ago, they had all believed that Li Yunmu would never return. On the day he came back to Earth, Li Yunmu didn't do anything and spent time with his family, recounting his experiences of the past years. He also learned from his mom and dad that the followers which had remained on Earth had indeed acted as agreed. Not only did they follow the plan laid down by Li Yunmu before he descended, they had also brought his family back to Lucky Wind City to hide them a couple months back. This was done with Battle Sage Vega's approval. Blade Overlord and Flowing Cloud had remained then to protect his mom and dad. The night passed silently. At dawn of the second day, there were many lords of the small region who wouldn't have met Li Yunmu previously waiting outside his residence. Among them, there was naturally Heavenly Cloud City's Lin Yuero. She had already stepped into the Sage Realm from Nirvana Flux Master Realm. Originally, she should have been part of the main force that was to enter the seventh dimension, but as a city lord of a secondary city, she requested the central continent's rulers to let her remain behind to protect her people. Li Yunmu didn't agree to see anyone. After some thought though, he invited Lin Yuero, who'd had some entanglements with him in the past. No one knew what the two talked about, but when Lin Yuero walked out of the residence, Li Yunmu's family as well as his followers had disappeared. The lords waiting outside couldn't even take a look at the first descender who had returned to Earth. Even the sage dispatched by the central continent's ruling power that very night was blown away by Li Yunmu with one punch when he tried to force his way into the residence. Li Yunmu wasn't trying to be a thankless wretch, but he didn't wish to remain a chess piece any longer. His success and accomplishments weren't bestowed by the central continent's ruling power, but were instead because of the system. Due to this, he didn't wish to lightly reveal the information of the origin world to any of continent's ruling powers. It would just create more headaches for him. Thus, he hid himself from the public eye. But the news of his return to Earth as well as the establishment of the Heavenly Bridge quickly reached the ears of every continent's battle sage in the 7th dimension in a single day. Li Yunmu's return even caused the battlefield which had become a slaughterhouse to regain calm. The next day, the powerhouses at the peak of Earth's power pyramid returned to Earth one by one. Battle Sage Vega also began to wait for Li Yunmu to reveal what he knew. However, all their hopes were crushed. Even if Li Yunmu had descended as the representative of Battle Sage Vega, he didn't go to Vega Palace to report. In the end, the powerhouses who believed that they held the fate of the whole world in their hands understood that when a chess piece gained enough strength, like Li Yunmu had done, it stopped being a chess piece. They began to see him in a new light when they learned that he had blown away a flux sage of the central continent with one punch. Just when the entire world was searching for Li Yunmu's whereabouts, Blade Overlord, Devil Monkey, Underworld Hand, Nangang Gongzi, and Flowing Cloud had gathered together in his heavenly world. So you're saying that Barbarian Niu's body was seized by God Undercurrent? Moreover, Ling Shuang is also under the control of someone else because of a secret method used by the enemy. Even at that moment, Li Yunmu wondered what had to have happened for Ling Shuang to not be able to cross Black Dragon Island. Chapter 556, Arrows Like Rainbows. Li Yunmu used both his hands to support his chin. With a bright light flickering in his crystal clear eyes, he directly commanded the followers to disperse. You all leave for the time being. I want to think alone. One after another, wisps of extremely pure flux energy were emitted from his body. They almost instantly enveloped the entire Lucky Wind City while he released killing intent which could cause anyone's heart to palpitate. Although the matter of Barbarian Niu's body being seized by God Undercurrent and Ling Shuang being controlled by someone else was troublesome, it was still far from frightening Li Yunmu. After all, a terrifying calamity was about to descend on the whole world. Some fluxers who worked for different powers and had come to spy on Li Yunmu under their command quickly evacuated Lucky Wind City. After all, who would treat their life as a joke? Once the 66 parallel planes merged, the entire world's surface area would increase by 66 times. It sounded like an opportunity for humans to expand and spread, but after careful pondering, it was clear that not only was it not an opportunity, it was actually a calamity. The parallel planes weren't the same. Not all of them were like that of Li Yunmu where a subtle equilibrium existed between the powers of all sides and dimensional beasts. There were many planes which were completely occupied by the dimensional beasts once the human race had been completely exterminated. Moreover, the strength of people of different planes was also different. When they met each other, they might not coexist in harmony. Becoming the master of the world was definitely the ultimate dream of every ambitious person. As the follower whose soul imprint was bound the earliest to Li Yunmu heavenly world, Blade Overlord could sense a wisp of restlessness and agitation in Li Yunmu's heart. Although he didn't know about many secrets, the omens of calamity had already appeared. There was an obscure valley outside Lucky Wind City where some weak dimensional beasts were hidden. Originally, this region was not worthy of even being mentioned, but when Blade Overlord had passed through it, he discovered that the whole valley had expanded by tens of times. Furthermore, he could even sense some strange and terrifying presences there. Disperse! Li Yunmu raised his brows, and his complexion suddenly turned gloomy. In the range of his perception, a powerful entity had swept through Lucky Wind City at a terrifying speed. After he carefully observed it, he discovered that this powerful entity was surprisingly an enormous dragon formed of energy. An extremely formidable powerhouse had sent the warning of his appearance in a high-profile manner, even when Lucky Wind City had been sealed off by Li Yunmu's flux energy. Although he couldn't confirm whether the other party had ill intentions or not, they definitely didn't put him in their eyes. Li Yunmu faintly smiled while saying with indifference, I wonder which power this lord is affiliated to? Who thinks so highly of me, Li Yunmu? The followers who had gathered just a moment ago were faintly startled. Although they didn't understand why Li Yunmu became furious out of nowhere, he had already given them a command. They cupped their hands toward him and transformed into rays of light that scattered in all corners of Lucky Wind City. Li Yunmu, who was sitting on the seat of the city lord of Lucky Wind City, raised the corners of his mouth in disdain and murmured, seems like I have been silent for too long. The lords who believed they controlled his destiny had sent out their trusted aides, one after another, to find Li Yunmu. Although it looked like they treated him with great importance, there were still many who didn't put him in their eyes and only regarded him as a youngster who they could force to yield whenever they wanted. They wanted to understand the situation in the origin world, and then, using methods filled with enticement and threat, they would force him to become the daring vanguard in their battle in the seventh dimension. They would also glorify his name by saying things like, he must strive to obtain even more benefits for humanity. Humanity should preserve more of its forces. Once such a huge responsibility was fastened on Li Yunmu's head, he would be forced to act as their blade no matter how domineering or formidable he was. Otherwise, he would be considered as a cheap person who didn't take the big picture into consideration and only cared for his personal benefit. Because of that, regardless of how he acted, he would be forced to give up on his life in the end. Thus, the most beneficial action for Li Yunmu under his circumstances was to wait. Even if he considered himself to be someone who could play the chess, none of the genuine big shots considered him to be anything more than a minor character. Because of that, with all the variables in his hand, Li Yunmu was waiting for the best opportunity to enter the highest arena. He was waiting for the so-called big shots to discover that they were unable to confront the imminent crisis by solely relying on the little bit of strength which they considered as majestic and grand. Naturally, they would then think of him. After settling his thoughts, Li Yunmu stood up from the seat, and an incomparably tyrannical flux energy rushed out from him. Ripples spread out through the air, similar to how it looks when a large stone is thrown into a calm pond. Blind shot, unleash. Before his words were even finished, a black long bow congealed of flux energy appeared in his left hand while his right hand pulled the bowstring. 8 black-red flux energy arrow filled the surroundings with vicious currents once they appeared on the bow. A split second, Li Yunmu locked on the fluxers in Lucky Wind City and those in the vicinity who were affiliated to him. The next moment, blind shot, the skill which wasn't influenced by any sort of illusions or false targets was unleashed with Li Yunmu's rising killing intent. Ka-cha, ka-cha. As Li Yunmu's both shoulders moved, a terrifying physical strength of 2,500 oxen exploded and pulled the flux energy longbow. The next instant, 8 black-red rays of light which held the desire to shoot the sun itself were launched toward the sky from the direction of the city lord's manor. In the air, they exploded and scattered into countless black-red rays of lights that flew in many directions. Ding! You have comprehended a great archery skill, Thunder Fiend Soul Hunting Arrow. The flux energy arrows contained the power of thunder energy and blood fiend power. Because of the skill, they also possessed the special property of hunting souls. It meant that as long as the targets upon which he had locked didn't leave his attack range, the flux energy arrows would exterminate them without any doubt. Since Li Yunmu had decided to continue waiting, then before the mysterious powerhouse came to find him, he had to eliminate all the informers hidden in the vicinity of Lucky Wind City. As for those who escaped the range of his attack, it was naturally impossible for them to learn about what he would talk with the mysterious powerhouse. Their equipment? The trash who were only used for passing information and running errands would never have any piece of equipment that would attract Li Yunmu's attention. With attacks formed of pure energy, he could easily get rid of such people. Chapter 557, First Display of Strength on Earth. Courting Death. Li Yunmu suddenly made a grab with his hand and looked into the distance like a tiger watching its prey. At the same time, 1,000 kilometers away from Lucky Wind City, the figure of a fluxer using his special ability to look at Li Yunmu's actions suddenly trembled and his body began to float in the air because of some strange power. Although the fluxer had sensed Li Yunmu shooting arrows toward the sky, he had believed that he was outside the range. Even if Li Yunmu unleashed all of his flux energy to sense the surroundings, he wouldn't be able to instantly uncover him. The only people who had escaped Li Yunmu's Thunder Fiend soul hunting arrow were those who were stationed at the edge of the city. Yet this person was courting disaster by believing that he could spy upon Li Yunmu. Forgive. The fluxer had barely opened his mouth when he exploded like a ball of blood after being squeezed by Li Yunmu's power. After instantly killing the enemy, Li Yunmu lightly flung his right hand as if wanting to get rid of the non-existent blood. Boom, boom, boom. A series of explosions echoed. Li Yunmu slightly raised his eyebrows and looked at the sky above while tilting his head. Given his present situation, even if he had his eyes closed, he could still sense an extremely formidable existence descending upon Lucky Wind City. Moreover, the opponent was exceptionally arrogant, directly attacking the flux energy field laid down by him. Mid-stage flux sage. Li Yunmu lightly mumbled, then straightened his head. Another one rushing to his death. Before he even finished speaking, an ethereal dragon soared into the sky. Its body flickered once, then appeared right in front of the attacker. The enemy didn't show any panic towards Li Yunmu's sudden appearance. He stopped attacking and said with a smile, "You are Li Yunmu? Seems like you indeed have some strength, so my trip wasn't in vain. Now pack your things and follow me." Li Yunmu knitted his brows slightly. The enemy's unreasonable feeling of superiority and the tone of his command angered him. A mid-stage flux sage trash dared to believe that he was invincible in this world? After some thinking, Li Yunmu lifted his right hand to make a push in the air, using the terrifying strength of 2,500 oxen. Since the enemy had no intention of acting nice, he also wasn't going to hold back. Thump! The muffled sound of bodies colliding instantly rang. After all, the speed at which the 2,500 oxen physical strength was discharged wasn't any lower than the speed of light. Furthermore, the distance between the two of them wasn't very large, thus the enemy ate a punch at Li Yunmu's full strength due to carelessness. The enemy's slender form was sent flying like a kite without a string because of Li Yunmu's power. Before waiting for the enemy to stabilize himself, he moved slightly and appeared behind the flying body. He raised his right leg and kicked the enemy upwards. Seeing the enemy's body soaring into the sky, Li Yunmu raised the corners of his mouth disdainfully and lifted his right leg. By that time, the enemy had already lost momentum and began falling back down. At that moment, it came under Li Yunmu's fierce kick. The mid-stage flux sage was ruthlessly sent toward the ground below, where he sank more than 1,000 inches. Dominance. Absolute dominance. From the time Li Yunmu had started attacking, the situation had been under his complete control. During the series of attacks using only his physical strength, the mid-stage flux sage hadn't had the slightest ability to resist. Li Yunmu's battle had attracted the attention of many fluxers in the city. However, no one dared to provoke him. When his followers saw him crushing the enemy with ease, they simply moved to protect his family and the ordinary civilians. Li Yunmu's figure gradually descended. When his legs touched the ground, he bowed his head and looked at the miserable figure smashed deep into the ground. Even if the mid-stage flux sage hadn't been on guard, such attacks definitely weren't lethal to him. Although Li Yunmu's attacks seemed meaningless when viewed like that, they had forced the enemy to accept his situation as the weaker one. "I am someone dispatched by God undercurrent. Li Yunmu, you definitely won't have good end." A miserable shriek echoed from the deep hole. Vu! Li Yunmu smiled, not hiding his scorn, and slowly lifted his right hand to unleash disaster punch. Explosive power burst forth and crushed the mid-stage flux sage lying in the hole into a mass of blood. Although Li Yunmu had guessed long ago that some of the big shots would come to find him, He hadn't expected that it would be so quick, nor that the first one to come to ask for his surrender would surprisingly be a subordinate of God Undercurrent. The person had been attempting to take on the entire world on his own. Li Yunmu had no interest in having a deep conversation with such a person. A person who was bound to fail should leave the stage quickly. From now on, Fluxers who dare to take a step into Lucky Wind City will die. Li Yunmu looked around with cold eyes, emitting his extremely tyrannical presence. From that moment, all the Fluxers trying to spy on him could consider themselves dead. Even a mid-stage Flux Sage was completely powerless when facing Li Yunmu. With such a large difference in strength, who would dare to stand out? There was only one thought in the hearts of all the Fluxers: this isn't an affair in which I can participate, must pull back immediately and report. Right after, Fluxers of all sorts of appearances and ages packed their things and fled. Li Yunmu laughed slightly. He didn't think much of the group of fleeing Fluxers. Even if the mid-stage Flux Sage hadn't been dispatched by any human faction but was instead a subordinate of God Undercurrent, the Fluxers had heard and seen many things which they shouldn't have, so how could they think of escaping? How could I possibly allow you to leave? A glimmer of coldness which could cause anyone's heart to palpitate flitted across Li Yunmu's crystal-clear eyes. Just when the Fluxers left Lucky Wind City, one of them lifted his hand in astonishment to point toward a group of black-red rays of light which were nearing them and cried out in surprise, "What is that thing?" Chapter 558, Gaining Control of Lucky Wind City. When the 8 enormous black-red rays in the sky scattered into flux energy arrows, all of the Fluxers who felt that they were targeted spit out a mouthful of abuses. None of them even attempted to beg for forgiveness. A ruthless person like Li Yunmu, who had decided to exterminate them and had attacked without any warning, would not change his mind. There was no point to wag their tails and beg for forgiveness. One after another, the black-red arrows penetrated the bodies of the Fluxers. Some of the more powerful people used all sorts of methods to disperse a portion of flux energy and then tried to quickly escape the range of the attack, but what awaited them were even more flux energy arrows. "Nangong, flowing cloud," Li Yunmu lightly called. The flux energy near his body slightly trembled, and the hole formed because by disaster punch instantly filled with soil. During this time, Nangong Gongzi and Flowing Cloud, who weren't far away, quickly transformed into 2 rays of light and arrived near Li Yunmu. "Master." Nangong Gongzi cupped his hands towards Li Yunmu and indifferently asked, "Please give your instructions. Even 10,000 deaths will not prevent this subordinate from completing them. There is some filth in Lucky Wind City. You all go and quickly clean it." While clasping both hands behind his hand, Li Yunmu calmly gave a single instruction. Nangong Gongzi shuddered slightly, and even felt his breath stopping for a moment. Although he had known long ago that Li Yunmu was a decisive person when it came to killing, it was different this time though. When he heard Li Yunmu's request to clean the city and tried to calculate how much blood would have to flow, he came up with an astronomical amount just on the first guess. Although many of the Fluxers in Lucky Wind City belonged to the powers which had helped Li Yunmu's followers, other powers had also gradually arranged their strongholds here, stationing groups of Fluxers. During the past few years, Nangong Gongzi and the other followers who had remained on Earth hadn't focused on increasing their strength, but they had stayed in the King's true territory where time passed at a different rate and kept nourishing themselves with divine blood. Thus, they could no longer be considered as weak. All 6 of them possessed strength comparable to that of Flux Masters. What concerned their genuine combat strength, they could even battle against Nirvana Flux Masters after having used divine blood to supplement their cultivation. As the saying goes, train the troops for 1,000 days, and they will be useful for 1 day. Right then, it was exactly the time to display their worth. "As you bid." Flowing Cloud didn't hesitate like Nangong Gongzi. She simply cupped her hands toward Li Yunmu, showing that she had received his command. After Flowing Cloud and Nangong Gongzi retired, Lucky Wind City was sealed by an indescribable power. This time, Li Yunmu used his full strength and even drew assistance from the void disk to lay down a restriction on the little town. He had no intention of letting anyone leave. Ordinary Fluxers could never break his restrictions. After 3 full days passed, the restriction enveloping Lucky Wind City was removed by Li Yunmu. At that moment, all the powers who had waited for a long time poured into the city like a tide. The next moment, an extremely terrifying news was spread: the majority of Fluxers had disappeared from Lucky Wind City. The remaining ones, those who were loyal to Li Yunmu, had injuries and some had even lost an arm or a leg. The air reeked of blood, which caused everyone entering to choke. Most of the buildings had turned into ruins, from which it was clear that a desperate battle had taken place. Something like that could even be considered a purge. Once this information spread, the leaders of the major powers who were in the 7th dimension stopped their assault and began to wait and watch. This allowed God Undercurrent, who had been oppressed by the powerhouses, to breathe a sigh of relief and begin to quickly restore his strength. Has Li Yunmu gone crazy? He conducted a purge in Lucky Wind City. Could it be that he isn't afraid of provoking public anger? Does he believe that he has the strength and reserves like God Undercurrent, which would allow him to resist being suppressed by our various powers? Ha ha ha, provoke public anger? He doesn't care, but I want to ask you something: even if you could attack Li Yunmu, would you dare? If you somehow don't manage to kill this youngster and allow him to escape, then what about the future? If any of your disciples went out to train, he would kill them all. Do you understand now? Humph. What do you mean? I don't believe that the youngster Li Yunmu would truly dare to act in this manner. Only if he could live eternally would that make sense, otherwise, the future of his Lin family would certainly be doomed. Lin family? He has no one to carry on his ancestral line. Even if he has parents as well as a sister, he could easily protect them by relying on his strength and lifespan. That youngster is barefooted, so naturally he isn't afraid of us. Looking at the quarreling powerhouses, Battle God couldn't help but knit his brows and say in a profound manner, everyone present here has a high status while he is just a mere youth. What kind of wave could he raise? We are still. Battle God, guard your tongue. Battle Sage Vega glanced at the Battle God with a frosty look and said in a muffled voice, can't you see? Although we have successfully managed to invade the 7th dimension, we haven't made any major progress and everyone has lost many soldiers and resources. They are only using him as a pretext to kick a fuss and nothing more. After hearing her words, an old man with white hair smiled faintly and walked forward from the ranks of the powerhouses while speaking brightly. Battle Sage Vega's words have a small discrepancy. We aren't using this matter as a pretext to kick a fuss. The news that 7th Dimension's battle is stuck in a stalemate is public knowledge. Now a ruthless killer like Li Yunmu has also appeared, and no one knows what he will do next. Although Battle God had declared that he will put aside all the grudges for the time being, a character like Li Yunmu had not existed at the time. This youngster had risen abruptly from the lowest status of an ordinary person and become an outstanding big shot. All his actions were ruthless and aimed at achieving his target by hook or by crook. Because of that, many powerhouses in the 7th dimension had a grudge against him. Who knew whether Li Yunmu take hold of the opportunity and lead his people to exterminate some subordinate powers? It has to be known that almost all the powerhouses were in the 7th dimension at that moment. Who would then dare to obstruct the path of Li Yunmu and his followers? No one. Li Yunmu's strength was probably higher than anyone else on Earth at that moment, so they would only use any method available to them to escape from this calamity. That was why the top powerhouses began to panic. Li Yunmu had grasped their next move and had conducted a blood purge in Lucky Wind City to make sure that the small fish didn't dare to provoke a tiger again. Also, it would force the powerhouses to choose a fitting person to come and ask for his conditions. Another layer of frost joined Battle Sage Vega's already cold face. Clearly, she was furious with the people who were using this matter as a pretext to kick a fuss, but she couldn't flare up. Given the situation, they had to remain united to deal with the matter of the 7th dimension. Chapter 559, Battle Sage Vega's Choice. After a long time, Battle Sage Vega exhaled loudly. The group of powerhouses making unnecessary racket also calmed down. Everyone clearly understood that although their usage of Li Yunmu as a pretext to kick up a fuss couldn't be considered a success, it also couldn't be considered a failure. They had managed to force Battle Sage Vega to make a choice. Once she opened her mouth, Li Yunmu's momentum on Earth would certainly be restrained. Yet this action would deeply offend Battle Sage Vega. Not to mention that the current situation of the battle couldn't tolerate their internal strife. Although they could say that Li Yunmu wasn't giving them face, he could be considered a powerhouse under the Vega Palace. In other words, wouldn't it mean that if they tried to deal with Li Yunmu, they would be attacking Vega Palace's honor? Despite that, they had still forced Battle Sage Vega to personally interfere. Although many of the peak powerhouses maintained a neutral expression, revealing neither joy nor disappointment, they had already made a decision in their hearts. In the following battle, regardless of whether it was them or their subordinates, all of them had to give 120% of their strength. If they didn't obtain many achievements in the war after offending Battle Sage Vega, their future would be miserable. After all, when the 66 parallel planes merged, there would certainly be a chaotic battle between humans' powers and dimensional beasts. At that time, they would definitely be unable to survive without assistance, and it was possible that Battle Sage Vega might personally drop in to settle their debt. Frontline God, pertaining to Li Yunmu's matter, I will have to trouble your great self to make a trip personally. Battle Sage Vega's voice was indifferent, but when a person of her status addressed Frontline God as your great self, it was undoubtedly an important matter. After reflecting on it for a bit, the top powerhouses understood the implied meaning behind Battle Sage Vega asking Frontline God to make a trip personally. Li Yunmu's possession of a part of Azure Dragon deity suit wasn't a secret, and everyone knew that Frontline God also possessed 2 parts of Azure Dragon deity suit. Thus, Battle Sage Vega's intentions were very clear, but was Frontline God willing to cooperate? Frontline God slowly raised his chin and licked his lips before stating, Honorable Battle Sage, I am not clear about your meaning. If you say that these people are scared of that youngster Li Yunmu, then they need to offer him some benefits. But using me to deal with that youngster, relying on what? Frontline God greatly emphasized on the last 3 words without concealing his formidable killing intent. If not for the present situation, they wouldn't be sitting together at the same table as their enemy, but the fact that they didn't mean that they genuinely considered each other as friend. A single part of Azure Dragon deity suit wouldn't provide him any great increase in strength, but who was to say that he wouldn't be able to obtain other parts in the future? Even if he didn't do anything about Li Yunmu right away, he would find an opportunity sooner or later. But if the youth gave away his piece of Azure Dragon deity battle, then on what grounds would Frontline God would attack him in the future? Although the youth couldn't be considered to have genuinely entered the group of people forming the top of Earth's power pyramid, for better or worse, he was still a powerful and famous expert. If he went and gave away his treasure, then how would he still have the face to return? Humph! Battle God coldly humphed and examined Frontline God with a gloomy face before coldly saying, Frontline God, humanity should act as one right now. The battle is stuck in a stalemate here, so it's impossible for any of us to return to Earth to negotiate with Li Yunmu. But you can leave for a time being, and you also possess enough capital to negotiate with Li Yunmu. Bang! Battle God paused slightly and heavily slapped his thick palm on the table, before continuing. Moreover, we've never said that you won't be compensated for the trouble. Whatever benefit you obtain from Li Yunmu, you can keep it for yourself. Moreover, we will also compensate you, but if you are not willing then I... What? Frontline God licked his lips and sneered. You glorious battle God wouldn't go as far as to actually fight in front of these people, would you? Since Battle God had begun to cultivate, he appeared like a completely thick-headed person despite collecting many achievements. But this didn't mean that he was such a person. Otherwise, how could he have reached such heights instead of perishing long ago after being schemed against? Frontline God was using indirect attacks for a reason. Regardless of whether Battle God attacked him or not, the situation wouldn't have a good ending. All of a sudden, Battle Sage Vega raised a jade white finger and calmly said, 100 years. My Vega Temple and War God Shrine will form an alliance with you for 100 years. During this time, regardless of whoever it is, as long as they are an enemy of your frontline heaven, they will also be considered as our enemy. At the same time, the elder which had spoken before cleared his throat and stated, Old Ghost Frontline God, since it involves us too, we would also take out our treasures to compensate you for the trouble of making this trip. We won't neglect your losses and will make sure you don't lose out. As long as you provide us with a reasonable list of items, we will provide it to you as compensation. All right. Frontline God lightly nodded and glanced around, taking a look at all the top powerhouses present in the military tent before replying in a deep voice. Since everyone has spoken so much, then if I Frontline God refuse now, I will be considered as someone who doesn't have an understanding of times. I shall personally make this trip. Battle God cupped his hands toward Frontline God. Then I will have to trouble you to attend to matters on Earth. Humanity is currently facing an enormous calamity. Even our combined strength may be considered as too weak to tackle the situation. Therefore, we definitely cannot afford a mistake at this critical juncture. I understand, Frontline God said in a terse voice before nodding toward Battle God. If I was a person devoid of common sense, I wouldn't be sitting in this tent today and wouldn't have listened to your nonsense for so long. Since you all displayed your sincerity, I definitely won't be lacking it. Then we will be relying on you. Battle Sage Vega also cupped her hands toward Frontline God before waving her slender hand, which caused the tent to instantly open. Her action of personally opening the door for the departing Frontline God was a show of extreme respect for him. How many people in the world had received the honor of a battle sage personally opening the door for them? After Frontline God left the human army's camp, a meaningful smile came to his face. He lightly pulled on empty air with his hands, and a dimensional passage leading to Earth opened up. The next instant, Frontline God entered it, and his presence vanished from the seventh dimension. Chapter 560, One Punch. Li Yunmu expressionlessly walked out of his hidden chamber. For the past 3 days, his 18 shadows had been hacking crazily, but when he looked at the cultivation of Thunder Fiend's soul hunting arrow, it had only reached the integration realm. This was something which had never happened since he had obtained the system. But Li Yunmu didn't inquire with the system about it. After reaching his current realm, he could feel a mysterious indication by the will of heaven and earth which made him conclude that his archery skill wasn't a simple A-grade skill. Naturally, the indication by the will of the heaven and earth didn't stop at this. He also calculated that on that day he would face a great calamity from which he couldn't escape. If he survived it, he would get a new lease on life. Once it passed, he would gain endless opportunities. Li Yunmu, quickly come out and meet this old man. A thunderous voice echoed over Lucky Wind City's sky. Before Li Yunmu could even respond, all the fluxers in the sky fell down. A tyrannical presence instantly sealed off the skies of Lucky Wind City. However, regardless of how much everyone searched, they weren't able to find the person behind the voice. The calamity has arrived. Li Yunmu lightly shook his head, and his terrifying flesh power activated. He slightly bent his legs and jumped, using the ground as a springboard. When Li Yunmu came a small black dot in the distance, cracks spread like a spider web from the spot where he had been standing. Li Yunmu stepped into the empty sky, his every step making an extremely powerful booming sound. He didn't use Azure Dragon Expert armor to fly, but walked in the sky with his physical strength. This was also a type of cultivation, since like this Li Yunmu could increase the efficiency of his physical power usage to the max. With all of his power available at a moment's notice, he would always be in complete control and wouldn't be scared of it running rampant. It was impossible for Li Yunmu to make another breakthrough in a short period of time. This wasn't only related to insufficient resources, but also because if his breakthrough speed was extremely fast, it would make his foundation unstable and maybe even cause his previous efforts to go down the drain. In the sky, there was a tall and sturdy silhouette shrouded in black. It was standing motionlessly, allowing the strands of flux energy searching for the source of the noise to sweep past him. Whenever it neared him, it would be isolated by an invisible power and transmitted to another region. Li Yunmu and the black-clothed man were 10,000 meters up in the sky, watching each other for a long time. Finally, Li Yunmu said with a faint smile, "Your distinguished self is powerful. Even now, I cannot see through your distinguished self's cultivation. Why has your distinguished self come to my Lucky Wind City?" The black-clothed man pointed toward himself while speaking in a low, muffled voice. "I didn't come to Lucky Wind City as your enemy. You can put away the battle skills you have prepared to use. Even if I attack you, you might not be able to do anything to me." "Ha." Li Yunmu coldly looked at the other party and said, "You say you don't have enmity against me, and you think that I'll believe you? Probably even you yourself don't believe it. I have come to present you with an opportunity. I want to see whether you will dare to take it or not." After interrupting Li Yunmu, the black-clothed man opened his left hand, and an azure halo rose above it. It stayed there, but at the same time, it looked like with a gust of wind, it would fly 10,000 meters away. Li Yunmu narrowed his eyes and mumbled, "Azure Dragon Deity Suit? So you should be the master of frontline heavens, frontline god. Since you took this out, why still hide the tail? Speak, what do you want? Take one hit from me, and this piece of Azure Dragon Deity Suit will belong to you." Frontline God waved his right hand once, and the azure halo quickly advanced toward Li Yunmu. The next instant, an extremely terrifying presence burst forth from Frontline God. Surprisingly, it wasn't the slightest bit lacking compared to that of Li Yunmu. Frontline God was widely known for his defense, but according to rumors, he only relied on the pieces of Azure Dragon Deity Suit. Even if Li Yunmu hadn't crossed paths with the enemy before, he hadn't expected that once the other burst forth, he would reveal such terrifying physical strength. Li Yunmu didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless when confronting such a terrifying entity. Azure Dragon Expert Armor, which was covered in azure flames, condensed on his body, and his tremendous physical strength also became agitated. Boundless majestic power which had been amplified by Azure Dragon Expert Armor began to howl in his blood vessels. Arrow Evasion and Admiralty Cover were fully unleashed in an instant. Within a split second, they accounted for the might of the enemy's attack. If Li Yunmu relied on Flash Step and 9 Phantom Heavenly Insect Step, the enemy's attack might not even reach him. As for the bits of the attack which managed to reach him, they would be handled by his defense. But Li Yunmu didn't choose to retreat. At the core, he was a proud person. Although being innately lazy had diminished his pride and taken away care about his face, it couldn't fully extinguish the flames in his heart. Why should I retreat? Why does he think he can make me retreat? He pressed forward with powerful momentum and unleashed the most formidable fist technique in his arsenal, Disaster Punch. Boom! A thunderous explosion filled the entire sky when the punches of Frontline God and Li Yunmu came in contact with each other. It felt like only 2 huge fists remained in the entire world. The next instant though, terrifying shockwaves spread from them as the center. There was a gentle cough, and Admiralty War and Azure Dragon Expert Armor instantly vanished from Li Yunmu's body. He also gradually withdrew the hand which had collided with Frontline God's punch. It casually wiped away the thin trail of blood coming out from his mouth. That was right. When their fists collided, Li Yunmu actually received injuries which couldn't be considered minor. If it wasn't for his body's defenses which had no flaws, the force of the attack would have probably shattered his internal organs. Frontline God was truly terrifying. He was certainly worthy of being a famous top powerhouse for a long time. Compared to Li Yunmu's sorry state, Frontline God was in a good shape. He pulled back his hand and turned around to retreat through the space.